Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining TL Insider's Fireside Chat with this month's artist in residence, Omar El Akkad, Giller Prize winner, to discuss his career, the evolution of his artistic practice, and the future of writing in Canada. Omar is an author and journalist. His debut novel, American War, was an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages. It won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award and the Oregon Book Award for Fiction and the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. He currently lives in Portland, Oregon. Omar has been named the winner of the 2021 Scotiabank Giller Prize for his novel, What Strange Paradise. Welcome, Omar. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Jason Maganoy, Head of Business Development at St. Joseph Media and the Associate Publisher of Canadian Business. Thank you both so much for your time today, and take it away, Jason.
My first question is, so how are you and how have you been holding up during the pandemic?
I'm pandemic okay, I guess, is the closest I can come to a decent answer. We have two young kids at home. We have a pandemic baby, a 1-year-old, and we have a 4.5-year-old where we're sort of counting down the days to her 5th birthday. We're going to run to the vaccine clinic as soon as she is. So it's been difficult in that regard. Just I think for a lot of people, the isolation is an issue, and for me, it's sort of the opposite. I'm seeing more people now than I usually see because I'm a huge introvert and I stay alone at home writing. But they're the same 3 people. Family, but we're okay. We're healthy. We're doing all right. I am preemptively grieving the much better person that I plan to be on the other side of the pandemic. I'm going to go to the gym every day and I'm going to pick up all. None of that's going to happen, but as long as I'm locked at home, I can pretend that I'm going to be that person. But we're okay, and we keep deluding ourselves into thinking that this is the last wave, and we'll get through it and go back to normal. How are you doing? How are you holding up?
I did the exact same thing. I had a pandemic baby as well. I have a 5-month-old, and we're sleep training him right now, so he can wake up at any moment and join us. And if that's the case, that is just the future of how we do content in the virtual space. But it's been great. It's been positive, and we're healthy as well. So we're happy about that.
Glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it.
So how did you get your start so it's a 2-pronged question. How did you get your start as a writer, and what compels you to create?
Fiction has been home for as long as I can remember. I often talk about this notion that I'm one of those people who doesn't have a good answer to the question, where are you from? I was born in one place, but I left when I was 5. I grew up in Qatar. I'm a citizen of Canada and the US. I've been a guest on someone else's land since I was 5 years old. And I suspect that people like me gravitate towards a place like fiction because you can sort of alter the contours of that made-up world to fit your experience. And so one of the hallmarks of not just my 2 published novels, not just the 3 thoroughly unpublishable novels that came before that, also the short stories, pretty much everything I write in fiction is this idea that I mess around with borders and I mess around with geography. The first thing you see when you pick up American War is that I've this map where I've sort of buried the eastern seaboard and Florida's underwater, and I've given the Southwest back to Mexico and all of this. So that's always been home for me, is to sort of retreat into fiction. But I also come from a particular culture where, if you talk to most Arabs, certainly the ones my age, it's this idea that when you're a kid, you're not going to grow up to write stories or make music or art. That's not it. You become a lawyer or an engineer, a doctor. And so when I came to Canada, that sort of influence was really heavy on me. And my degree is in computer science. I went to Queen's and I got a degree in computer science. I can't program my way out of a paper bag. I have no idea. I barely know how to use the computer I'm on right now. I don't know why they gave me that degree. I certainly didn't deserve it. I never went to class, and the whole time I was at Queen's, one day I saw an ad in the student newspaper. They were looking for an assistant news editor. And I figured, hey, I could write. They'll allow me to write. And as soon as I joined the Queen's Journal, that was it for me. Somebody was going to allow me to write, and they were going to publish the things I wrote. And I was fortunate enough over the time I spent at Queen's to build a portfolio where I was able to apply to an internship at the Edmonton Journal. And then the summer I graduated, I applied to the Globe and Mail, and they hired me on, and that's where I spent the next 10 years of my life. So I got very, very lucky that I found something adjacent to the kind of writing I wanted to do. And that's where I got my education. And for me, that was by far the biggest break of my professional life, was getting into the Globe. Um, and from there, I was able to get an education in writing, but also in history. You know, I got to see history firsthand, and that made all the difference in my life.
Wow. And as a journalist, you've covered the Arab Spring, you've covered military trials in Guantanamo Bay. How does your journalistic work inform your fiction? And then my follow-up to that is, how did, like, you're covering really explosive, sometimes very dark things that happen in our world. How does seeing the world like that inform your view of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's you can sort of see those 10 years in everything I write in terms of fiction, even the stuff that's really out there, the sort of speculative fiction, the sci-fi stuff. It works its way into on every level. So there's the experiential level, of course, of sort of the things I've seen, the things I've experienced, and the sort of residual experience, right? Because when you're working in journalism, if you can put something in the form of an answer, if you can answer the question who, what, where, when, how, you can put it into the journalism. That's what it's for. But a lot of times you're left with these questions for which, in my case at least, I had no answers. And that's when I retreat into fiction. You know, there's nothing particularly prescriptive about any of the fiction I write. I sit with questions. And so it was an outlet for the residual experiences of journalism that I couldn't fit into the form of an answer, where I couldn't quite explain this thing I had seen, this thing I had experienced. So it worked its way in that way. Also, just at a line level, I mean, anyone who's worked at a newspaper or magazine, magazines particularly they fact check the hell out of everything, right? Like if you write something for Toronto Life, you're not going to sneak in, a fact that doesn't exist. The first day at the Globe, the very first day I showed up, the senior backdesk editor, this guy Greg O'Neill, sits me down and says, "Listen, kid, I'm going to tell you what I tell everybody who walks into this newsroom. At the Globe, all reporters are gods, and all of the editors are atheists." And it was his way of explaining to me that, if there was one adjective too many, if I got purple, if I got self-indulgent, they were going to slash that copy. And so 10 years of having that happen really sort of influence, like, people who think my writing is purple now should have seen it before that 10-year education. So on a technical level, it influences. Also, it was my only experience with working in a corporation. At the end of the day, a newspaper is a corporation. For the vast majority of newspapers, it's a corporate entity. And so you see what HR is like, you see what the financial, we used to have to fill out the same kind of like self-assessment forms every year that everybody in every other department had to fill out. And so it's like, what deliverables did you achieve in terms of the stakeholders? I'm like, I don't know what any of this means. So you get a sense of how a corporate entity works as well. So all of that worked its way in. In terms of just the effects of being in these places, I think it's twofold. One is that you realize when you're in situations where you're seeing violence on a grand scale, not just physical violence, not just RPGs, that sort of thing, but also bureaucratic violence, linguistic violence, all of these different forms by which people can be subjugated and can have their lives destroyed. There is the sense of looking at it through the lens of the newspaper you're working for and realizing just how pragmatic and cold the other side of that lens can be. So, when Canada still had intense military involvement in Afghanistan, there was no question about us having a reporter there and covering it daily. And then as soon as that started to pare back, it didn't matter in the slightest what was happening to these people anymore. We were going to base our which I understand on a pragmatic level. Fine, you're a Canadian newspaper, so on and so forth. But just to see that lens, to see something really rooted in human tragedy reflected through that lens was difficult. The other side of it, I think, is just there's a sense of personal fraudulence that seeps in, or at least did in my case, when I would cover these stories. Just by virtue of my worldview and my temperament and the kind of human being I am, I gravitate to these stories. I gravitate to stories about the results of systemic injustice and systemic wrongdoing. That's what I do. I'm not particularly good at it, but that's where I gravitate. But when you're in these situations, you realize that you have the central privilege of being a tourist in someone else's misery. You parachute in, you write about these things that these folks do not have the option of running away from, that they have to live with. And then you get to get the hell out. And that's been a central source of deep unease in my life, both as a journalist and as a writer of fiction, because of the subject matter that I gravitate towards, is just how incredibly privileged I am and whether I have any right to do this. I don't know. I don't know if the counterbalancing effect of putting the work out into the world sufficiently offsets the reality that I am a tourist in someone else's misery. That's been the central question of my writing life, I think. And I don't have a sufficient or satisfactory answer to it. It's just something that's in my head a lot.
Wow. And that actually is a really good bridge into my next question, which is why fiction? You know, because of the fact that you've had the ability to cover the world journalistically, what is it about fiction that makes it ideal, in addition to the way that you're sort of taking the world and adjusting it and exploding it, et cetera? And in terms of the world that we're living in now, is fiction the best way to engage with it?
I've been thinking about that a lot, about this idea of what fiction does that nonfiction doesn't do, and the very sort of abstract, ephemeral quality to what fiction does to the reader. And the best I can come up with is this idea that I'm pretty well aware of what nonfiction does to me. You know, I recently read a book about the disaster at Chernobyl, and I now know that at the moment of meltdown, the core reactor was the same temperature as the surface of the sun, and I can sort of throw that around at cocktail parties and sound smarter than I am, and that's fine. Like I'm fairly aware of what nonfiction is doing to me. Most of the time, every time I read incredible nonfiction, it has a similar effect. It starts to veer into the world of what fiction does to me. And what fiction does to me is sort of changes me without me understanding it, or it takes me much, much longer to understand what fiction is doing to me. So, you know, I can tell you about what I learned about Chernobyl from reading that book. It took me a very long time to understand what Song of Solomon was teaching me about the power of names and the agency associated with the names that you give yourself versus the names that are imposed on you. It took a very long time to understand how that was changing me as a person. So my sense, and I could be completely wrong because this is a half-formed thought, as are most of my thoughts. I should apologize in advance to your audience, but my sense is that I am currently living in an age where it is perfectly acceptable for everything, every vector pointing inwards and outwards from the mind to be very short-term, to have very short-term reactions, very short-term indulgences, very short-term dives into particular subject matter, the sort of bite-sized element of whatever it is that we live in right now. And what I want to do is, as much as possible, operate in the opposite arena. I don't want the thing that you see the tweet, immediately understand the tweet, digest the tweet, move on to the next tweet. I want something where you're not entirely sure what it's doing to you until later on. And I think that's why I gravitate towards fiction and long form fiction in particular. But again, that might not be the case at all. That's just why I think I gravitate to it.
Oh, I love that. So what was the catalyst for What Strange Paradise?
I have the privilege of thinking up very clean Genesis stories. That's one of the things you do when you're an author, is after the fact, you're just like, yeah, this happened, I wrote a book, it's fine. And so of course it's a lot messier than that, but the Genesis story, the closest thing I have to one for this book, in 2012, I was still working at the Globe and Mail. I was in Egypt. I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And I was born in Egypt. A lot of my friends are Egyptian. And one of my old high school buddies was driving me around town, just sort of showing me around. And while we were doing this, he was complaining about rent. Rent's too high, rent's too high. And at one point I asked him, I said, so what's the price of an apartment in your building, for example? And he said, well, do you mean the locals' price or do you mean the Syrians' price? I said, what the hell's the Syrians' price? Like, what do you? And he said, well, we've had this influx of people coming into the country and they don't have any choice. I mean, what are they going to do? Go somewhere else? You can charge them 3 times as much and get away with it. And just the sort of casualness of that cruelty. I wanted, again, you're left with these difficult questions, because this wasn't just happening at a kind of like institutional level where the rich apartment owner was doing. This was happening like when you go to buy fruits and vegetables at the stall down the street. They would catch your accent real quick when you started speaking Arabic, and they realize you're not from here. They put 2 and 2 together. Suddenly you're being gouged. And I wanted to write about that, and I wanted to think about that. And so that was the first sort of seed that eventually sprouted into What Strange Paradise. Years later, I kept working on it and working on it. And eventually I came to a particular construction where I decided what I wanted to do was take the central trick in all of my fiction. It's not a particularly clever trick, but the central trick is inversion. I take things that are happening to people over there, I make them happen to people over here. For What Strange Paradise, I wanted to take a comforting fairy tale that Westerners have been telling their kids for 100 years, and I wanted to flip it around and use it to tell a different kind of story. So I took Peter Pan, the original sort of Peter Pan fable, and I wanted to use it to tell the story of somebody who's being subjected to this kind of treatment. And that's how What Strange Paradise as a sort of structural element came together, was I wanted a repurposed fable. And over the course of writing this book, you would see these stories over and over again, migrant shipwrecks, these horrific photos. And one of the things about it is, in addition to the central horror of all of this, there was such a temporary component to it. Again, it would show up on my Twitter feed and everybody would be outraged, and 24 hours later, it would be as if it never happened. And I wanted to do the opposite of that. I wanted to dwell. So that's sort of how it came together. And, there's that thing David Cheriandy says about writing. When he wrote his book, Brother, every time he edited it, it got a little bit shorter. And he was afraid that if he kept editing, it would just stop existing. I had a sort of similar experience where every time I would edit this book, it would get a little bit shorter. And so in many respects, it's the opposite of American War. American War, my first novel, is like a kitchen sink book. It's got all kinds of elements and it's sprawling. And this was the opposite. This was sort of honed in on a particular moment and a particular psychology and emotional landscape. And once it came together, I thought there was no way it was going to be published. It was very different from American War. And there wasn't that much interest in it, to be perfectly honest. My Canadian editor loved it. But for the most part, my editors were not particularly excited. This was some stuff that was happening to other people over there. There was no world building or futuristic element to it. So they kind of, I thought that it was a bit of a career ender, and I got very, very lucky.
In the book, like, why the perspective of young people when creating the narratives of the book?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I go back to that place quite often. And that's not to say that I know how to write children well. I think a lot of my critics will tell you that I have no idea how to write children. Maybe they have a point, but I do gravitate to that time in life. I think that a part of it is that for me, childhood is the site of our only really honest interaction with the world, before all of the various compelling forces of capitalism and just the lies we have to tell ourselves to get through the day. Before any of that stuff kicks in, I think there's a fundamental honesty to the way we sort of the interface we have with the world when we're kids. And because, again, I'm drawn to writing about systemic injustice, and those systems rely on a fundamental fraudulence. They rely on lies. That's how they get through. And so to collide those two things has always been a function, the function of my writing. I collide the fundamental honesty of childhood with the fundamental fraudulence of these systems that we've created to benefit a select few of us at the expense of everyone else. With this book in particular, a lot of the interactions the kids are having, a lot of the exchanges they're having are from my own childhood. And so I generally don't have the chance to do that in my fiction. I don't know if I've had a very interesting upbringing, but I've had a very specific upbringing. There's like, you can read literature about growing up in this place or this place, but there's very little literature about growing up in Egypt until the age of 5, and then moving to Qatar for 11 years, and then moving to Canada, and then moving to the US, like that very specific kind of thing. And so I think I write about being unanchored. And a lot of that is for me related to childhood, because that's when I first realized that I wasn't from a place in the same way my parents were from a place. I think all of those things come together to bring me to childhood quite often when I write.
Wow. I was so excited to have a chance to speak with you, because I'm a writer as well. I went to the National Theater School. One of my close friends was also nominated for the Gillers, the same as you, Jordan Tannehill. When you beat him, I was like, who's this guy? I got to go after him. It's just...
I can't tell you how much I despise Jordan. Like, to be the best playwright of your generation, like, to be so good, and then in your spare time, to also write.
I'm gonna write a novel,
killer novel. Like, just
yes.
This is my space, man. Just don't be good at this. Don't be good at like multiple things. I don't know. Jordan's the nicest human being. He was so kind to me, and I think his work is just. Most recent one, the virtual reality thing that he did.
Yeah. Yes.
That is. Anyway, sorry. Yes, I'm of the opinion that Jordan is an all-timer. Like,
yes, that's what I love about him, and there's this thing about like this process, because I know so many writers, and everyone, I have friends who are writers who they'll write everything out onto paper and then they'll stick it onto a wall, and it's just all of these different things, and then they just write on the wall. Like, so in terms of your writing process, what is it like? Like, you made that joke, you made that observation, you kept editing, the book would just cease to exist. So what is your process like, and what was it like for this book?
Yeah, I lean real hard on my journalism background. So when we used to do investigative reporting, we would spend weeks putting together these charts of connections between various people, and a lot of that stuff works its way. I might actually have it right here. Hold on. I'm going to try and get up without you guys seeing that I'm actually wearing pajama pants. That's probably not going to work.
It's okay.
So, like, there's, I don't know if you can actually see it, but there's sort of, I write these documents, these sort of big character and narrative documents that help me sort of figure out where I am. And there's chapter outlines and all of this stuff. And it gets to be too much at a certain point, actually. It gets so that I lean on it too much, and it starts to kill off the serendipity value. At a certain point, you want to be able to just wander into the unexpected place. And when I do too much of this, it starts to close that window for me. So I'm trying to pare that back a little bit. Yeah, I do a lot. I do usually about a year and a half of research and sort of plotting out before I start to write. The first draft usually takes about a year, and then there's about a year and a half of rewriting. So that's generally, with the 2 books that got published, that's generally how it works. I'm in awe of anyone who works in the medium of film, theater, anything that, because the stuff I write, there's a lot of bushes you can hide behind and sort of like camouflage your lack of talent. You can do it, like, there's tricks in fiction, particularly long form fiction, where you can sort of hide those deficiencies. But when you're talking about a screenplay, when you're talking about something that is to be performed, you've got plot and you've got people talking, and the occasional stage direction or whatever. But if you ever go back and look at the I don't know why anyone would do this, but the New York Times review of American War specifically mentioned that the dialogue was melodramatic and the plot was convoluted. The things you can't hide behind. There's no tricks to that. So I'm in awe of anyone who can sort of strip away all of the, the hiding places and really get at. And I've been trying my best to work in screenplay form and to work in those kinds of forms, not for publication, not for getting it out into the world, just to hone those muscles. So yeah, I'm in awe of anyone who can do that well. But usually I depend on a lot of like substructure before I start writing. And I'm trying my best to pare that back a little bit.
So that thing you showed us, was that a sneak preview of an upcoming book?
No, that's What Strange Paradise. That's
Great.
That is the narrative underpinning of the before and after chapters. The new book has currently 6 paragraphs, all of them bad, all of them to be deleted, and about 30 pages of notes. So we're a long ways from anything coming of that.
And I love what, like, going back to what you were saying about not being anchored. And, as the world gets smaller, the world is getting smaller because of climate change, political disarray. So mass migration is becoming this giant issue. So the larger question of, the question of home. So what is home? How do we find a new one? And as borders implode, how will people create new homes for themselves in this world?
I mean, it's a fascinating and it's a question that's huge in scope, right? A while back, I was writing an essay about, it's for an anthology that's coming out later this year of climate change essays. And I was writing about this idea of when we think about something like climate change, which I think is very clearly going to be the defining crisis of our time, possibly the existential crisis of our species. There's a tendency to set it in the context of the future. This is what the world will look like. This is so on and so forth. And of course, that makes sense. I live in the woods here in Oregon, and the largest fire in our history keeps becoming a new fire. It's like the previous year's record is broken by this year, and this year will be broken by next year. And of course, there's a tendency to look to the future. But I was thinking about how it's going to also alter our past. There is this civilization of which there were very few remains. It was located in present-day Iraq, and a couple of years ago, the drought got so bad that the water level shrunk to the point that it revealed structures of the civilization that had never been seen before. And so suddenly, it's not just your future, it's not just your present being altered, it's also your past. There's a huge disconnect between the writers I love and the kind of writing I do. And the writers I love marinated in a place. Naguib Mahfouz, Toni Morrison, these are people who understood their place down to the marrow. And I can't do that. I don't have the talent that these writers have, but I also don't have that oneness of place. And I think that there's going to be more and more people like me, where there's a disconnect, where home is no longer a place. Home's not even a set of places, because some of those places might no longer exist in a way that is functionally related to what they were when you were there. Like for me, I grew up in Qatar. My first kiss, the first time we drove a car without a license, all of these memories, like the stuff you see in all of the coming of age movies, all of that happened for me in Qatar. If I go back to Qatar right now, it is unrecognizable to me, because of the oil and gas money, but also if I live an average lifespan for this part of the world, by the end of my life, that place might become literally uninhabitable because the temperature will have gotten so high as to no longer fit the category of a place that is fit for human habitation. So I used to think of home and being displaced as someone being forced from their land. And increasingly, I think of the inverse of that. What happens when the land is forced from you? What happens if a drought or rising sea levels or some function of what we've done to the world essentially pulls the land out from under you instead of you being pushed away from the land? And I think we have a particular emotional and literary lexicon to describe what it means when you are forced from your home. We're just beginning to put together a similar lexicon for what it means when your home is forced from you. And I think that's probably where a lot of my writing is going to take place, is in that idea of that inversion and what it means, not so much for me, but for my kids.
In the book, one of the characters says there are two kinds of people in this world. They're not good and bad, they're engines and fuel. Go ahead, change your country, change your name, change your accent. You'll always be fuel. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I get into a lot of trouble, I think, because people think I agree with what my characters are. I very rarely agree with anything any of my characters have to say. That said, I don't know how much I can disagree with that sentiment. So this guy is there's the before and after chapters, and Muhammad the smuggler's apprentice is the sort of Captain Hook of the before chapters, the boat chapters. He's this very cynical human being. He's seen this journey a lot, and so he's had it with these people's naivete, what they think the West is going to give them, and so on and so forth. When I lived in Qatar, there was these shopping malls. The thing about going to places like Qatar, like Doha or Dubai, a lot of the Gulf countries, is that it's always like home to the world's blankiest blank, the world's biggest indoor ski slope, the world's whatever. And so at the time, there was a big competition between Qatar and the UAE of who could build the biggest like shopping mall or something like that. And all of this stuff I find incredibly frivolous, but it is what it is. The thing is, the people who built this place only wanted a particular kind of clientele. They wanted locals, they wanted white Westerners, and that was it, right? What they didn't want are people from the part of the world, or the people who essentially built these countries, people from Pakistan, people from India, people from the Philippines, the third country laborers, I think is what they're called, who effectively built these countries. And this was codified. And so what they did was they hired a guy from, I believe, a Pakistani guy, put him at the front entrance and said, hey, if you see anyone who looks like you, turn them away. And I have never been able to forget that, not even the abject cruelty of it, not even the overt racism, but just how much you have to believe in a world that is vertical and hierarchical and set in stone to be able to inflict something like that on someone. The fact of the matter is that a lot of the views of the world when it comes to migration, when it comes to being a guest on someone else's land, particularly at a governmental level, have this notion of the eternally grateful, or the sort of, like I remember reading all of these stories about this town loves Trump, but their one ER doctor is a Nigerian immigrant. And I'm like, why is the expectation that you come here and become an ER doctor? Like, that's a pretty high bar to, I think that, I don't know if I believe fully in a world of just engines and just fuel and just people to be used up for the services of other people. But I can't fully not believe in that world either, because everywhere I look, there is evidence that we have codified exactly that kind of world. So that's my very sort of cowardly way of saying that I don't fully agree with what my character says, but I don't think I fully disagree either.
I mean, there's this sense of things falling apart, like in the book, like whether it be cities, societies. And one of the things that and it is really fascinating to sort of be, and it is that sort of distance where you're reading a book, it seems to be set somewhere far away, but then it's not far away. It's manifesting. Like, do you feel that this idea of things falling apart is manifesting at home? Do you see this in the United States? Do you see this in Canada?
I mean, I'm an outsider almost everywhere, and so I have a somewhat limited. I mean, all my opinions on everything are of limited value, but particularly in this case, we have a system. And I see this particularly in the United States because it's a very loud place. It's obviously the superpower, it's the heart of the empire, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a very loud place. And so by definition, I'm going to see these things more overtly here. But you have this societal construct where almost every vector is oriented away from the communal good and towards the individual good. Away from having a halfway decent response to Hurricane Katrina and towards inflating the net worth of Jeff Bezos, right? Like that vector is very well defined. And it's not just capitalism, it's sort of hyper-capitalism. And obviously, we have Facebook as a result, and we have all of these the conveniences, and I can order things from Amazon and they're here 2 hours later, and that's great. But we also have a set of crises headed our way, and some of them are already here, that require the exact opposite vector. I don't know how much personal charity is going to offset the wildfires that almost burned down our house a couple of years ago. I don't know how much Jeff Bezos can give of his net worth to end the pandemic. I worry about that collision. I think every generation has its version of things seeming like they're falling apart. And having only access to my own generation's experiences, I can't talk about whether it's better or worse, or whether the default mode of the apocalypse being a nuclear holocaust compares to the default mode of the apocalypse being climate disaster. Like I was born somewhere between the handing, the passing of the torch from one vision of the apocalypse to the other. Everyone has their kind of thing, the overarching nightmare. But I do worry about this collision of an incredibly individualistic society coming up against problems that require a communal response. And if we're having this much trouble getting people to put on masks and take a vaccine that's 90-some% effective, what are we going to do when we have to stop using fossil fuels? I mean, it's terrifying to me. I don't have any answers to this stuff, but this is the sort of thing that kind of keeps me up at night.
Congratulate. This is a question of about writing, which is congratulations on winning the Giller Prize. That is incredible. And you're in the States. You're in the States. You're in work in Canada as well. So what's the literary scene like in Canada in particular? Like, do we do enough to support writers here?
I'm trying to think of what the scene would have to be for me to be like, yeah, we're doing enough. Things are fine. If anything, we're too generous with these folks. I've had the privilege of sitting on grant committees, and one of the things about sitting on those committees, I've done this in Canada. I've never done it in the US. I have no idea what that landscape is like in the US. But in Canada, I've judged a lot of writing competitions, and I've sat on a few grant committees now. And one of the really fascinating, it's an incredible privilege. It's a ton of work because you have to read a lot of these things. But it's an incredible privilege because it shows you what the future is going to look like. What people who are certainly much more capable than I am are thinking about. And of course you have your trends, right? You have a million people who want to write a pandemic novel. And of course, I get that. You're stuck at home. This is the thing, right? But also the sheer variety of work that is being produced. And when I first came to Canada, I showed up in '98, and I retreated into reading as quickly as humanly possible because I didn't understand this country in the slightest. I remember I got on a bus in Montreal for the first time in my life. We had no public transit in Qatar. And I tried to jam a 20 in that coin slot, and assuming the guy would give me change. Like, I didn't understand anything at all. We had no sidewalks in Qatar. That was a new thing. Taxes, all of that. And I retreated into books. And there was a certain set of, I was given the canonical works. I was given the canon. Here's what you should read. And there was a similarity to that. It was beautiful work, but it was very much outside of my experience. And I had those conflicting thoughts about how incredible this was and how little it reflected anything that I had been through. And now I look at these grant applications, and the sheer variety of work that is being produced is really heartening. Right now, we actually are, at a national level, at the very least, I assume also at a provincial and territorial level, we are actually doing more than previously. Because of the pandemic, a lot of the funding for a lot of grant programs and a lot of sort of fellowships has actually been increased. So the Writers Trust, for example, has given out way more money than they usually do. You look at that and you see that with that increased funding, you're just getting to a place where it seems reasonable. And so my hope is that if we're ever on the other side of this pandemic, these numbers don't suddenly plummet. A lot of this stuff, of course, relates to which government is in power, which party is in power, so on and so forth. But I would be incredibly pleased if I got to sit on one of these committees after the pandemic and those numbers were still as high as they were. That is my hope.
And I love that idea of sitting on a grant committee and just getting a sense of what writers are interested in and what they care about. And it is true, like every time I've been on the committee, every time I encounter work, I'm like, wow, like it's really phenomenal that we're all thinking about this, and this is what we're going to be engaging with next. So we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. But before we do, what is next for you?
I was supposed to be in Kingston doing a writing residency at Queen's, my alma mater. That all got turned virtual, so that's gone to hell. I've just started on what I hope will be the new novel. Again, I'm like 6 paragraphs in. I don't want to tell you more about it because I want to reserve the right to run away if it starts falling apart. I have a couple of things coming out this year. I have a story in an anthology. I have a bunch of stories in anthologies, including the first piece of comedy writing that I've done in like 20 years. I used to write comedy. This will come as a huge surprise to people who've read my incredibly depressing books, but I used to write comedy. So I have a bunch of that coming out later this year. But for the most part, I'm trying my best to just go into the cave and kind of try and see if this new thing will work. That's it probably won't, but that's where I am.
Incredible. So thank you so much for that. And for everyone in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please, you can turn your camera on and you can ask away. So we'll give you a chance to do that.
Yeah, I have the same reaction to those grant applications as I do to Jordan, where I'm just like, damn you, this is so good. Why is this? This is the competition. I can't. Yeah.
No, it's funny because there'll be times when I'll be like, because in my writing, I would have the opportunity occasionally to write for TV, and they'll be like, what's on the TV hive mind? It's like, we are really into futuristic vampires who are lawyers. It's like, okay, well, not sure if that's okay. That's going to move the needle for culture, but it'll get you a show. So it seems like your answers were incredibly thoughtful, and it's here we go. It seems like you have answered everyone's questions, and people are shy to turn their cameras on. But Omar, thank you so much for joining us today. It was incredible hearing about your work and your career, and thank you so much for being part of this residency program. Every quarter we welcome a different artist, so it was an honor to talk to you and talk to you about your work today. So thank you so much.
The honor was all mine. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.